At 40,000 feet, one of the engines exploded. Passengers screamed. Flight attendants rushed through the aisle. Then the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Get the pilot from seat 14. My sister burst out laughing. "Her? She's just a toy soldier." I ignored her and followed the crew to the cockpit. 10 minutes later, I had my hands on the controls. When the wheels finally touched the runway, 300 people were still alive. The thing about flying is that it teaches you to read the air long before the instruments confirm what you already know. A pressure drop, a shift in cloud formation, the way a certain silence before a storm feels different from the silence of open sky. You learn to trust what your body registers before your mind has named it, and over years that instinct becomes something you carry everywhere, not just in the cockpit, in every room. I had been reading the air in my family for a long time before anything was officially declared. My father built his money the way men of his generation did, carefully without display over decades of small decisions that compounded into something substantial. He'd grown up with very little, and that scarcity had calcified into a particular kind of discipline. He didn't waste, he didn't explain himself. He kept his counsel, and by the time I was old enough to understand what he'd accumulated, the decision of where it would go had already been quietly made in ways I couldn't yet see. My sister was 8 years older than me. By the time I was finishing high school, she was already embedded in my father's world, working adjacent to his interests, managing the peripheral businesses, positioning herself inside the architecture of his estate in ways that looked like dedication and functioned like acquisition. She was good at it, I'll say that much. She understood exactly what the relationship required, and she provided it. Proximity, attention, the daily performance of indispensability. She showed up for the dinners. She came early to the meetings. She learned the names of his colleagues and called them on their birthdays. She never once asked for anything directly, which is how she got everything. I went into the military at 19, not as a protest and not as an escape, because I wanted to fly. I started as a cargo pilot, spent 3 years learning the specific humility of getting a heavy aircraft into places it had no business being. Mountain ranges at altitude, the kind of cold that defeats instruments before it defeats the body. Runways carved into plateaus where the ground drops away on 3 sides and the approach angle is a matter of geometry and nerve. Airstrips in the early morning dark where the lights were compromised and the only thing you had was the altimeter and your own best judgment and the knowledge that if you got it wrong, there was no one else to account for it. By year 5, I was cross-trained into tactical transport. By year 8, I had been deployed twice, flown through weather systems that don't get named because they form and collapse in the same day over ocean water that nobody closely tracks. The kind of flying that doesn't produce photographs, that doesn't make the news, that gets documented in papers no one outside a specific clearance tier will ever read. I was good. Not in the way I said to people, I didn't say it to people, but in the way that gets noted in performance reviews and deferred to in rooms where decisions have to be made quickly. My sister mentioned that I flew at family gatherings the way you'd mention the weather, present, noted, filed away, moved on. The gap between us had grown so gradually that neither of us registered it as a choice. It was simply geography, career, calendar, the particular friction of 2 lives organized entirely differently that happened to share a bloodline. I didn't resent her for it, not exactly. I understood why my father found her easier. She was there. I wasn't. And the version of love that requires constant presence is a real version, not a lesser one. But then the year my father's health began to fail, the gap stopped being accidental. I found out about the diagnosis from a cousin, not from my sister and not from my father. A brief message, forwarded almost carelessly, that contained enough medical terminology for me to understand it was serious. I called my father that evening. He answered, sounded tired, said it was manageable. I asked if I should come home. He said it wasn't necessary. I should have gone anyway. I understand that now. Instead, I called twice more that month, once the next. The conversations grew shorter. I told myself he was tired, that he'd never liked talking on the phone. Both things were true. But underneath them was something I recognized only in retrospect. By then, the decisions were already being made, and my presence would have complicated them. My sister had been filing paperwork for at least 2 years before he died. Powers of attorney, financial restructuring, beneficiary designations, the quiet administrative work of inheritance carried out while I was on deployment in airspace that didn't show up in any news cycle. While I was logging hours in aircraft that didn't have my name anywhere visible, I found out later from an attorney who had no particular interest in telling me and told me anyway that the disqualifying clause had been added 18 months before the end. The language was surgical. It cited a post-deployment psychological evaluation from a year I had been grounded for a concussion I'd walked off in less than a month. The concussion was real. The evaluation was real. What it had been made to mean was not. She had used it to remove me from the document before I'd even known there was a door to close. I flew home for the hearing wearing my dress uniform, not as a statement, because I hadn't packed anything else. The military routes you back through channels when something personal requires leave. There are forms. There are approvals. You don't simply decide to go. You petition your way out of one operational rhythm and into another. I filed the request on a Tuesday evening from a base in Germany, sitting in a corner of the administrative building with the fluorescent lights doing their work overhead, and the forms asking for reason and duration and point of contact. And I typed the information in without ceremony and submitted it and went back to my quarters to pack a bag. I had 11 days. The hearing was in 4. The transatlantic flight was military standby, which meant I spent 6 hours in a seat near the rear of a cargo configuration that had been adapted for passenger use in the way that things are sometimes adapted rather than designed. Not uncomfortable, not comfortable, simply functional, which felt appropriate. I had a window that looked out at nothing. Clouds, then darkness, then clouds. clouds again. I tried to sleep and didn't. I read a maintenance manual I'd been meaning to finish. Around hour 4, I put it down and just sat there, thinking about the photograph my father kept on the shelf in his study. The two of us at an air show. I couldn't have been older than 8, my hand in his, both of us looking up at something out of frame. He had loved planes, in the abstract way that men who never flew them sometimes do. The engineering, the physics of it, the idea that something that heavy could negotiate its way into the sky purely through the application of principle. He used to say that everything worked if you understood the underlying logic well enough. I think he believed that about business too, about people. I wonder sometimes if he understood what my sister's underlying logic had become. I wonder if he did understand and found a way to make peace with it, or if the papers she put in front of him in those last months arrived when his judgment had grown soft around the edges and she knew it. Either way, I was flying home to find out the result. The base I'd booked accommodation at was 40 minutes from the firm where the hearing was being held. I took a taxi into the city the morning of, in uniform, because I hadn't packed anything else, and I sat in the back while the driver navigated morning traffic and said very little. The city looked the same as it always had. I hadn't been back in almost 3 years. 3 years is long enough for a city to remain essentially unchanged and for you to feel the change entirely in yourself. The way the streets that used to be familiar now require a small act of recalibration. The way the distance you've accumulated shows up most clearly in the places you grew up. The firm occupied the 14th floor of a building that managed to look both expensive and generic, the way law firms often do. I checked in with the receptionist, was shown to a waiting room with a low table and chairs arranged for the appearance of comfort. There was a water dispenser and a bowl of mints. There were framed prints of nothing in particular on the walls. I sat and waited. I was 20 minutes early. My sister arrived 4 minutes before the meeting was due to begin, moving through the reception area with the particular quality of motion of someone who has been in many rooms like this one and has never found them intimidating. She wore a charcoal suit. Her hair was pulled back. She had a leather portfolio under one arm. She saw me, registered my uniform with an expression that lasted perhaps half a second, and then sat down in one of the chairs on the opposite side of the waiting room. She didn't speak. I didn't speak. The attorney came out at exactly the scheduled time and let us in. The conference room had the particular quality of spaces designed to feel neutral. Round table, 6 chairs, a credenza along one wall with a water pitcher that no one touched. The attorney sat across from us, his files organized into a sequence that I recognized immediately as the shape of his job. This conversation would be linear, professional, and as brief as could be accomplished without appearing rushed. He was a man in his late 50s who had done this many times and intended to do it many more, and he regarded the two of us with the practiced equanimity of someone paid to be equally useful to all parties while belonging to none of them. He introduced himself. He confirmed our identities. He noted the date and the file reference number and the specific legal framework under which the estate had been structured. He did all of this without looking up from his documents for more than a few seconds at a time, and the effect was of a performance that had been run so often it no longer required an audience. My sister sat to my left, her portfolio open, a pen already in hand. The attorney began with the overview. The estate was substantial, not publicly known in size, but substantial, accumulated across 40 years of careful investment, real property, and private holdings that my father had never discussed in detail with me, and apparently had discussed in considerable detail with my sister. The total value was described in a range. The range was high enough that I understood, sitting there, that the numbers I was hearing represented a version of my father's life I had not had full access to. The distribution, the attorney said, was structured as follows. To my sister, primary beneficiary and executor. The investment portfolio, described across 3 pages of the document he was reading from, which he did not show us in full. The residential property in Connecticut. The associated trust account containing the primary liquid assets. Controlling interest in 2 private holdings that I had not known existed. A specific provision that gave her discretionary authority over the disbursement of 2 secondary accounts, the parameters of which had been established in a codicil added 18 months prior. 18 months prior. I sat with that number quietly. To me, a personal memento, as per my father's written instructions. The attorney reached into a manila envelope, the kind used for documents too small to justify a proper folder, and placed 2 items on the table. A coin, military issue, worn along the edges in the way coins get worn when they've been handled over years rather than stored, and a photograph printed on standard paper rather than photo stock, which suggested it had been scanned from the original and printed recently. The photograph showed my father in 1973. He was standing beside a military aircraft, an F-4 from the markings, though the image was too low resolution for certainty. He was young in the photograph, younger than I'd ever seen him in a picture I could actually date. His expression was unreadable in the way his expressions were often unreadable, not closed, but organized inward, as if whatever he was feeling had been filed away before the shutter clicked. I picked up the coin. I set it back down. I looked at the photograph for a moment. The attorney waited. My sister did not look at me. He continued. There was, additionally, a letter. My father had written it by hand, and it was addressed to me personally and sealed, and the attorney slid it across the table in a smaller envelope. Per my father's instructions, the attorney said, its contents were private and were not part of the estate record. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket without opening it. The attorney asked if we had questions. My sister had several, precise, prepared, organized around implementation timelines and document sequencing. I could tell they were not actually questions, but confirmations of things she already knew the answers to. The exchange lasted 12 minutes. I know because there was a clock on the credenza behind the attorney's head, and I watched it without intending to. When it was done, the attorney gathered his papers, stood, and and said that he or a member of his team would be in touch regarding next steps. He shook my sister's hand. He shook mine. He left. My sister stayed in her chair for a moment, reviewing something in her portfolio. I stood and put on my jacket. She looked up. "You have what you need?" I looked at her. From a legal standpoint, she nodded once. Precise. Measured. The nod of someone who had managed a situation to the outcome she intended and was already thinking about the next one. "Travel safe," she said, and looked back down. I walked out into the hallway and stood for a moment outside the conference room door. The building's air system hummed. Down the corridor, a phone rang twice and stopped. I put my hand into my jacket pocket and touched the envelope there, and then I walked toward the elevator. I didn't open the letter until 3 days later, in the airport, because I wasn't ready before then. When I did read it, sitting in a gate chair with my bag at my feet and the noise of the terminal around me, it was not long, and it was not an apology, and it was not an explanation. It was my father's handwriting, which I recognized from childhood grocery lists and margin notes in books he'd lent me, and it said 3 things: that he had watched me fly, once from a distance, at an air show I had not known he attended, that he had been proud in a way he had not known how to say, and that the coin had been his father's, and before that, his grandfather's, and that he wanted me to have it. I folded the letter back into the envelope. I put it in the inner pocket of my jacket, next to the coin. My sister's flight was leaving from the same terminal. Lisbon's airport operates on the logic of all international airports, that the primary experience of travel is waiting, and that the quality of the waiting determines how you remember the journey. The building was glass and high-ceilinged and arranged around a central atrium that managed to feel both spacious and crowded, depending on which moment you were standing in. The light through the windows in the late afternoon was flat and silver. The sky above the tarmac the pale gray of deep Atlantic weather moving in from the west. I found the check-in counter for our flight and joined the line. The line was orderly in the way European airport lines are orderly, which is to say it was genuine rather than performed. People stood with their luggage and their phones and their particular preoccupations, and no one tested the boundaries, and after 8 minutes I reached the front. The agent processed my documents efficiently. When I handed over my military travel orders alongside my passport, she looked at them carefully, not with skepticism, but with the particular attention given to forms one has learned to read properly, and offered a small nod. Behind me in the queue, my sister had extracted herself from the adjacent line and materialized at my shoulder as if the whole enterprise had been arranged for her convenience. She waited until the agent had finished, then stepped smoothly forward and placed her documents on the counter. There was a quality to how she occupied space at service counters, not rude, but absolute, as if the transaction were primarily interesting insofar as it related to her. Outside at the gate, she made 2 calls in succession. I could hear the first from 3 seats away. A conversation about documentation sequencing, about distribution timelines, about when certain signatories needed to be available, business, the mechanics of having received what she'd spent years engineering. She spoke in the measured cadence of someone who has learned that authority is conveyed as much through pacing as content, and the conversation ended with her saying that everything was proceeding as planned and that she'd be available to sign by Thursday. The second call I couldn't hear as clearly. She moved away for that one, toward the window, and stood with her back partly turned and the phone close to her face. When she came back, something in her posture had settled. Whatever she'd needed to confirm had been confirmed. I sat with my bag at my feet and my jacket folded across my knees and watched the aircraft on the tarmac go about their business. There's a kind of professional comfort in watching planes being prepared. The fuel trucks, the cargo handlers, the walk-around inspections that the ground crew performs with the unhurried thoroughness of people who have run the same checklist several hundred times. It's repetitive and it's meticulous, and it means the machine will be ready. I find that reassuring in a way I can't entirely explain to people who haven't spent time around aircraft. We boarded 30 minutes later. My sister went through the priority lane ahead of me, which she was entitled to, and I followed through the same lane because she had booked for both of us. She told me in the car from the legal offices that morning that it would look strange if I flew coach. Optics. I had said nothing then, and I said nothing now. I took the aisle seat she'd assigned me without pointing out that she had decided what I would sit on and where I would be placed, which was a version of the same decision she'd made about everything else. The aircraft was a long-haul twin-aisle configuration, perhaps 2/3 full. Business class occupied the forward section. Wider seats, more distance between rows, the particular quality of quiet that premium cabins carry in the boarding phase before the ambient noise of other people's arrangements fills it in. My sister was across the aisle, 2 seats forward. I stowed my bag, sat down, and kept to myself. The flight crew moved through the pre-departure procedures, the safety demonstration which I watched, a habit I'd been unable to break since the early years. When watching it felt like professional courtesy and eventually just became reflexive. The door seals, the ground crew signals, the pushback from the gate, the engine start sequence, audible as a low rise in frequency through the airframe. The aircraft began to move. I looked out the window as we taxied. The lights of the airport terminal tracked past in an orderly recession. The runway appeared ahead in the growing dusk, its edges marked with the patient certainty of engineered light. We turned, paused, and then the engines rose to their working pitch and the acceleration pressed me back into the seat in the quiet, committed way of all departures. The moment when the calculation has been made and the variables have been accepted and the only direction left is forward. We climbed into the Atlantic gray and leveled off. Below us, Lisbon's coastline drew back and then disappeared into cloud. The flight to New York was scheduled for just under 8 hours. We were over open ocean within 40 minutes of departure. The Portuguese coast already behind us and nothing ahead but the Atlantic and the dark. My sister had her tray table down within the first 20 minutes. She opened her laptop laptop, connected to the aircraft's wireless, and began working with the undistracted focus of someone who understands travel as an extension of the office. She ordered a glass of wine when the flight attendant came through, drank half of it, kept working. Whatever project held her attention, she had decided it was the most important thing currently happening on the plane. I ordered water and did not open my book. Pilots develop a baseline attunement to the mechanical environment they're in. Quieter than hypervigilance, less effortful than active monitoring. You're simply available to information that arrives through sensation before thought. You notice it the way you notice a color that's been described to you, and now you begin to see it everywhere. The flight was smooth, the engines were consistent. The vibration through the seat and floor was the normal vibration of metal in sustained effort. And I registered this as right because that's how the skill works. You hold the texture of normal against what you're currently experiencing and note when they diverge. For the first 2 hours, they didn't diverge. My sister had closed her laptop and was reviewing printed documents. The cabin had settled into its nocturnal configuration, reading lights here and there, the quiet movement of the crew through their scheduled rounds, a child asleep across 2 seats somewhere in the rows behind us. The particular community of shared darkness that a long flight produces, where strangers are temporarily arranged into something that resembles a kind of trust because they have no alternative. She began typing a message on her phone around the 2nd hour. The typing was quick, not drafting, not revising, sending. When she finished, she set the phone face down and picked up her wine glass and looked out the window with the settled quality of someone who has completed something that had been on a list. Whatever the message contained, its sending had resolved a thing for her. There was a small stillness in her shoulders that I recognized from the conference room that morning, the stillness of a task finished. I turned back to my book. That was when the pitch changed. It was subtle, a small variance in the right engine's sound signature, a fractional deviation in the frequency that a passenger would file under turbulence and forget. I noticed it the way you notice a stopped clock, not by seeing it, but by the absence of something that should have been there. I put the book down and sat with it. The smell came next, faint and acrid under the recycled air. Chemical and burning, the kind of compound failure that has nothing to do with the galley. Then the right engine groaned. Once, twice, then something structural, deep in the wing, and the groan became a shriek. The intercom broke open before the screaming had settled. I was already unbuckled. A flight attendant's eyes found mine across the cabin. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The door at the front of the cabin opened. I followed the flight attendant through. The cockpit was the size of a large closet, and it contained 3 people in a crisis. The captain was in the left seat, slumped at an angle that was not sleep. His oxygen mask had slipped, the seal broken, trailing at his collar. His hands were not on the controls. The flight attendant said 12 minutes under her breath to no one in particular. The co-pilot was in the right seat and was losing. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. He was not panicking, and he was not making errors. He was a qualified professional doing exactly what he had been trained to do, and he was doing it correctly. But there is a rate at which a human body burns emergency resources, and the rate has a ceiling, and I could see from the doorway that he was close to his. His jaw was locked. His knuckles were pale against the yoke. The sweat at his temple was not the ordinary kind. He registered my presence without turning. Pilots register things they can't look at by incorporation, including them in the model of the cockpit and continuing to operate. I told him I was military flight, active, 10 years cargo and tactical transport, and asked him for the aircraft's status. He told me without ceremony. Right engine had compressor stalled and the failure had progressed. Engine 2 was producing no thrust. Fire suppression was active, and the hydraulic lines running through the starboard assembly were degraded. The flight management system had shed 2 redundant pathways. The captain had been unresponsive for 11 minutes. ATC had vectored them toward McNally Field in Nova Scotia, 6,000 feet of rated runway. They had been advised the fuel load made the approach marginal. He said, "I cannot stabilize the lateral trim while managing communications and the approach. I'm out of workable options." I said, "Move." He moved. The hesitation was real but brief, a professional's resistance to yielding control in any condition. And then it was done, and I was in the left seat with my hands on the yoke. The aircraft fought. With the hydraulics degraded and 1 engine gone, the docility engineered into the commercial flight envelope had been replaced by something that required constant negotiation, a persistent starboard drift that demanded continuous left-hand correction, a yoke that transmitted every asymmetric load back through the hands in a way that would become exhausting and was already demanding. I took my inventory. Altitude and speed appropriate for the emergency profile the co-pilot had established. Fuel load still substantial. A problem for runway requirement. Fuel dump on the starboard side already in progress, leading weight on the descent. The horizon indicator showing a roll tendency to the right. I corrected it. It came back. I corrected it again. I keyed the radio. McNally Tower, Sky Atlantic 219. Declaring emergency. Inbound your field. Engine 2 out. Hydraulics degraded. Captain incapacitated. Flight controls assumed by military pilot. Request emergency clearance and obstacle data for runway 17. The controller's voice came back within seconds, carrying the mastered composure of air traffic control in a crisis. The acknowledgement, the runway clearance, the weather conditions, and the obstacle information for the northwest threshold. 52 feet of trees at the approach end. Noted. The co-pilot said, 6,000 feet is short for this weight, even with the dump. I said, I know. He said, what's your heaviest field landing? Military transport at elevation, short strip, 28 tons. He didn't ask anything more. I took that as acceptance. The descent continued. Below us, the ocean was invisible. Cloud coverage at the lower altitudes and the darkness and the sense of descending into something without a floor. The aircraft made its sounds. The The asymmetric noise of a single working engine, the altered vibration of degraded hydraulics, the small structural complaints of a machine operating outside its preferred envelope. She appeared in the doorway. I didn't turn around. The change in sound quality at the door told me it had opened, and then the silence that followed told me who was standing there. My sister's silences carry a specific texture. I had spent enough years around them to know. They're not empty. They carry the weight of a person who is very rarely without words deciding for once that they have none. This one had that weight. She stood there. I knew she was looking at the back of my head, at the panel, at the single engine's glow on the port wing, and the absolute dark beyond the windshield. I knew she was processing a version of the world that did not match the one she had boarded with. The co-pilot glanced back once, read the situation, and looked forward again. I kept my hands on the yoke. The field was 50 miles ahead. The descent from cruise altitude into an emergency approach is a different kind of flying than routine line work. In routine line work, the descent is structured in advance, filed with air traffic control, executed against a programmed profile that the aircraft manages with only light supervision from the crew. The aircraft knows, functionally, where it is going, and the pilots are primarily there to monitor and override when necessary. In an emergency approach, there is no program. There is only the pilot and the machine and the specific negotiation between them. And the negotiation is constant, and it is physical, and it does not pause. We were burning altitude at a rate that I was monitoring against the distance remaining with a continuous half-conscious arithmetic that emergency approach requires. How much height? How much distance? What angle of descent does that imply? What speed am I carrying? What does the fuel load mean for stopping distance? What does the wind mean for the approach end? What do the 50-foot trees at the northwest boundary of the runway mean for my threshold crossing height? Each of these numbers updated as we descended. Each update altered the calculation. The calculation never resolved into a static answer. It was not that kind of math. The co-pilot was reading me the instrument data in the even, stripped-down cadence of a man who understood that what I needed was information, not interpretation. Altitude, speed, rate of descent, distance to field. He called each number and waited for the next interval. And I incorporated them without responding, because response takes bandwidth, and bandwidth was committed elsewhere. McNally Tower came in again. Emergency services in position. Runway clear. Wind now southwest at 14. I acknowledged and asked for confirmation of the tree clearance height at the northwest threshold. They gave it. 52 feet, noted. My sister was still in the doorway. I didn't think about it actively. She was a fact in the room, like the instrument panel and the wind and the degraded hydraulics, and I had already incorporated her into the model and assigned her a status of present, non-threatening, irrelevant to the current calculation. The mind does this automatically, in extremity. It files everything into one of two categories: factors that matter to the problem and everything else. She was in the second category. The cloud layer appeared at 1100 feet, exactly where the controller had said it would be, which was 1 point in favor of the weather data being current. We entered it, and it swallowed the windshield into gray-white opacity. This is a particular moment in emergency approach, the transition from visible world to instrument-only navigation, which concentrates the senses into the panel in front of you and asks you to trust numbers and needles to represent a terrain you can no longer see. I had done this in conditions worse than this. I trusted the instruments. At 600 feet, the cloud base broke and the field appeared. Not dramatically, not in the Hollywood sense of a sudden revelation. It appeared the way things appear out of low cloud, gradually, and then all at once, the fog beginning to reveal the threshold lights first, pale amber columns in the mist, and then the runway centerline, and then the dark mass of the surrounding terrain with the tree line at the far end barely visible as a different quality of darkness against the sky. 6,000 feet of runway. We were heavy and we were fast. I ran the numbers one more time with the information in front of me. The landing would be hard. The rollout would use the runway fully. The margin at the far end was real but not generous. There was no alternative strip within fuel range, so the question of whether to attempt a go-around was closed. This was the approach, and this was the landing, and those were the only facts. I said to the co-pilot, "Gear down." He activated the sequence. The landing gear extended with the familiar mechanical protest of systems in motion. The actuators, the locking mechanisms, the aerodynamic drag that the deployed gear introduced into the flight envelope. I felt the nose try to rise in response to the drag increase. I held the descent angle. The gear confirmed, down, and locked. The runway was filling the windshield. I had a moment, a genuine moment, not long, perhaps 2 seconds, of the specific clarity that comes in the last phase of a difficult approach. Everything that wasn't the runway, the speed, the angle, and the inputs disappeared. My sister in the doorway disappeared. The hearing room disappeared. The attorney's manila envelope, the coin in my jacket pocket, the photograph of my father at 20-something standing beside an aircraft he had never flown, all of it disappeared. There was the runway, and there was what my hands needed to do. The threshold lights crossed beneath us. I cut the power. The aircraft dropped. The nose pitched forward. I pulled back precisely enough to arrest the pitch without trading it for altitude, and the main gear touched first, both trucks simultaneously. A hard impact that transmitted itself directly up through the airframe and the seat and the base of my spine. The nose came down. The reverse thrust deployed. A sound like something being torn, controlled, and massive. The brakes engaged. The tree line at the end of the runway did what tree lines do in these moments. It got closer, faster than it had been getting closer, and then it got closer more slowly, and then it stopped. We stopped. Somewhere behind me in the cabin, someone made a sound, then someone else. Then, after 3 full seconds of complete silence that felt much longer, the sounds became what sounds become after something like that. Complicated, overlapping, the particular particular mixture of relief and shock and tears, and the involuntary exhale of 300 people who had been holding their breath without knowing it. I kept my hands on the controls until the aircraft had fully stopped. That's the rule. You don't unhand the controls until there is genuinely nothing more for them to do. Then I took them off. I unclipped the harness and stood up. The co-pilot was already on the radio, confirming the aircraft's position and the status of the passengers. His voice had the particular quality of someone who has come through something extreme and is now performing the procedural requirements of the aftermath, which is its own discipline, distinct from the extremity itself. He was doing it correctly. I didn't need to be in the cockpit for it. I stepped out. The forward cabin was quiet, in the way rooms go quiet after something irreversible has happened in them. Not peaceful. The peace would come later, if it came, for most of these people, probably as something that arrived gradually and was not entirely trusted when it did. What was in the cabin now was shock, and the particular physical quality that shock produces. The stillness of people whose bodies have run the emergency protocols and are now coming down from them. The flushed faces, the eyes that were looking at nothing specific. A few people were crying, not loudly, the kind of crying that is more exhale than expression, the involuntary release of held breath. A man in a business suit near the front had both hands flat on the seat back in front of him and was staring at nothing. 2 rows back, a woman had her face in her hands, and a teenage girl beside her had one arm across her shoulders and was speaking quietly into her hair. Near the rear of the business cabin, through the divider, I could hear more crying, and a child's voice asking a question that no one was answering yet. The aircraft had stopped on the runway. Through the windows, I could see the emergency vehicles approaching. Fire suppression units, 2 ambulances, what appeared to be an incident command vehicle with additional personnel. The lights were cycling through their patterns, blue and red, sweeping across the fog and the runway surface and the interior of the cabin in slow, cold intervals. The aircraft door opened from the outside. The emergency seal broke, and the cold air from the Nova Scotia night came in, carrying the smell of jet fuel and damp ground and the particular metallic quality of a November that had already decided it was winter. An emergency team lead stepped through, helmeted, with a radio at his shoulder and a clipboard in his hand. Behind him, 2 paramedics. The co-pilot stepped out of the cockpit doorway. He looked at the emergency team lead and said without elaboration, "Pilot, she brought us in." He indicated me with a nod, not theatrical, not a ceremony, the way you indicate a fact to someone who needs the fact for their record. The team lead looked at me, made a note, said, "Name and service branch for the incident report." I gave them. He wrote it down. That was all. That was the entirety of it. Not a speech, not a recognition, not anything that required anyone to express an opinion about what had happened. Just a name in a document that would be read by aviation investigators and filed in a record that no one could subsequently revise. The world had been given a record, and the record was accurate, and it existed independently of what anyone standing in that cabin chose to believe or say about it afterward. The emergency personnel moved through the aircraft. Passengers were being assessed. The paramedics reached the captain, still unresponsive, and began their work. People were being directed toward the forward door and the evacuation slide, and the orderly sequence of emergency exit procedures was being applied to a situation that had ceased a few minutes earlier to require emergency. I stepped back against the galley wall to let the personnel work. My sister was still in her seat. I noticed this not because I had been watching for it, but because the cabin was small enough that the space her presence occupied was visible to me. She was upright. She had not moved toward the exit with the other business class passengers, most of whom had already been directed forward. Her phone was in her hand, face up this time, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking toward the front of the cabin with an expression that I had not seen from her before in all the years I'd known her face. It wasn't grief. I don't want to assign her something she didn't display. It was the expression of a person who has held a very precise model of the world and has watched that model become inadequate, and who has not yet constructed a replacement, a temporary state. I knew she would construct the replacement. She was very good at constructing the replacement. But in this moment, in this aircraft, on this runway in Nova Scotia, with the emergency lights sweeping through the windows and her phone face up and unused in her hand, she had not yet done it. I looked at her for a moment. She didn't speak. I picked up my bag from the overhead compartment because I had been trained to take my kit when I left an aircraft, and I walked forward toward the open door. Behind me, I heard a flight attendant say something to her, something routine about the evacuation sequence, about proceeding to the exit. I didn't hear her response. I was already through the door. The cold hit my face. Below the threshold, the emergency slide curved down to the runway surface. I sat at the edge and pushed off and came down fast onto the asphalt, into the controlled chaos of emergency response. Personnel, vehicles, lights, the particular organized disorder of a crisis that has been converted, just barely in time, into an incident. I stood up. I adjusted my jacket. I put my hand into my pocket and touched the coin. Then I walked away from the aircraft toward the perimeter lighting, alone, in the cold, in the fog, in the November dark of a runway I had never planned to see.